A ekziston Perëndia? A ka të dhëna të mjaftueshme për të provuar ekzistencën e tij? Nëse me të vërtetë do të kishte Zot, a nuk do t'i jepte ai fund ligësisë dhe vuajtjeve në botë? Do t'i diskutojmë këtë pyetje me një nga filozofët më influencues të kohës sonë, Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig është profesor i filozofisë në Shkollën Teologjike të Albit në Kaliforni. Ai ka kryer studimet universitare në Kolegjin Wheaton dhe studimet master në Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Dr. Craig mori gradën shkencore doktor i filozofisë nga Universiteti i Birminghamit dhe titullin doktor i teologjisë nga Universiteti i Minimit. Dr. Craig është autor ose redaktor i më shumë se 30 librave, përfshirë Argumenti kozmologjik i kalamit, Paranjohja hyjnore dhe liria njerëzore, Kozmologjia e ateizmit dhe shpërthimit të madh, dhe Perëndia, koha dhe përjetësia. Në vitin 2016, Dr. Craig u shpall si një prej 50 filozofëve më ndikues të kohës sonë nga The Best Schools. Le të ndjekim tani intervistën e Dr. Craig dhënë posaçërisht për audiencën shqiptare. Dr. Craig, I want to thank you for taking time to respond to some of the questions that Albanians have concerning the matters of faith. I want to start our conversation together discussing a little bit about the name of your ministry, Reasonable Faith. So these two words that you have put together, reason and faith, aren't they incompatible with each other? Generally, it seems that either one accepts something as true by faith because it is divinely received and believed as such, or one uses reasoning to arrive at the truth. Don't you see a contradiction here?
I don't, Kaon, at all. The name comes from my book, Reasonable Faith, which was actually suggested by the publisher. This was the publisher's idea for a title of the book. And to be honest, at first, I didn't like it because I thought it was sort of boring. Reasonable faith, that doesn't sound very exciting or controversial. But as you point out, what I didn't realize is that in the minds of many people, this is very controversial to talk about reasonable faith. It sounds like a contradiction to some people. But I think that's because of a misunderstanding of the nature of faith. Faith, in the biblical sense, means trust or commitment to what you know to be true. And so on the basis of reason, we can know something to be true, and then we can put our trust or commitment in that thing on the basis of that conviction. So to give an example, several years ago, I had eye surgery. Now, before I would allow someone to cut on my eyes, we did research to make sure who was the top corneal surgeon in the United States. And it was only after that we were convinced that this was the top surgeon that I then put my trust in him and allowed him to do something so radical as cut open my eyes. And that would be an illustration of a reasonable faith. My trust in that doctor was a reasonable thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, how does this relate to faith in God, then?
I think that faith in God is very reasonable. I think that the view that God exists explains a wide range of the data of human experience. And moreover, I think that the historical evidence concerning the man, Jesus of Nazareth, gives good grounds for believing that God has decisively revealed himself in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, particularly by raising him from the dead. And so on that basis, I think that it's extremely reasonable to put one's trust in Jesus.
Now, I've been following your debate, and there is an atheist and you that you are debating. But the basic questions that I will have is concerning this topic, does God exist? About you have even written extensively. Who do you think should bear the burden of proof? Is the theist who should prove God's existence? Or is the atheist that should give evidence for God's non-existence? What do you think?
This is a very crucial question. I participated in 8 years of high school and intercollegiate debate competition. And the way the debate resolution is usually stated in academic debates is as an affirmative proposition, resolved that the United States government should give more military assistance to other nations, for example. And in that case, the person supporting the proposition has the burden of proof to support the resolution. But when the statement under debate is a question, not an affirmation, like, does God exist? Then both sides bear the burden of proof for their respective answers to the question. And so that is why you may have noticed I always have the debate proposition framed as a question so that both sides have to share the burden of establishing their case for their answer to the question.
Dr. Craig, how would you respond to someone who says, if God exists, why does he hide himself?
I would say that God has given ample evidence of his existence in such facts as the origin of the universe at a point in the finite past, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the applicability of mathematics to the physical world, the objectivity of moral values and duties, and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I think that gives ample evidence for belief in God's existence. And I don't think that the atheist can therefore complain that God has not given sufficient evidence of his existence. And if the atheist would demand, well, why doesn't he give more evidence of his existence? He could have made his existence patently obvious by, say, writing his name in the stars, God exists, or something like that. I would say in that case, God knows how much evidence to give to allow free people to make a rational decision as to whether they want to trust him or not, and that it's perfectly plausible that God knew that if he gave any more evidence of his existence, it wouldn't do any good in bringing more people to a saving love relationship with God. They might believe that God exists if he wrote his name in the stars. They might add an additional item to their inventory of things that exist. But that's no reason to think it would produce a love relationship with God, which is what God is really interested in. He's not interested in just getting people to believe he's there. He's interested in having a love relationship, a saving relationship with people. And I think it's very plausible that God knew that the provision of more evidence, in addition to the evidence we have, wouldn't have done any good in bringing about a greater love relationship between people and himself.
I want to respect one of the main concerns that those who reject the existence of God bring, and that's the argument of evil and suffering in this world. And if I would put in premises, it will go like this. If there were a God, then he would have put an end to the suffering and evil in the world. We all know that suffering and evil exist, therefore it follows that God does not. Do you find this argument convincing?
I really don't. I understand the emotional force of the problem of suffering and evil. There's no doubt that this makes it emotionally difficult to believe in God. But when I assess this argument as a philosopher, I think that that first premise lays a burden of proof on the atheist that is so heavy that no atheist has ever been able to bear that burden of proof. The atheist would have to prove that it's either impossible or improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world and for waiting to bring it to an end. I see no reason to think that he should have done so by now, rather than thinking that at some point in the future God will eventually roll up the scroll of human history and the suffering and evil in the world will then come to an end. So I remember who has the burden of proof here to support the premises. This is an argument from the atheist. And so he needs to give a good argument to think that if an all-loving, all-powerful God exists, he would by now have brought the evil and suffering to an end. And I see no way of proving such a thing.
Now, in your book, Philosophical Foundations, that you co-authored with J.P. Moreland,
Yes.
In the chapter discussing the theories of knowledge, you write something along this line. If we are capable of knowing something, this presupposes a designer of the faculties that make knowledge possible. This sounds as if you would make from this an argument from knowledge for the existence of God. If that's the case, how would you phrase this argument?
This is an argument that comes from the great philosopher Alvin Plantinga. And what Plantinga argues is that the best theory of how it is that we know something to be true is when our cognitive faculties are functioning properly in an appropriate environment. And he examines alternative theories of knowledge and shows their inadequacy. And the way in which he shows the inadequacy of these alternative theories is typically to conduct thought experiments in which all the conditions for knowledge are met on those theories, and yet it's obvious the person doesn't know what he believes. And the reason he doesn't is because his cognitive faculties are malfunctioning. And so Plantinga says the best account of knowledge will involve this notion of the proper functioning of your cognitive faculties. But then you see, this puts the atheist in a real awkward situation, because what account can a naturalist give of proper functioning? Proper functioning means something is operating as it was designed to function. And what that implies is that there is some kind of a designer of our cognitive faculties. And so Plantinga says his whole theory of knowledge is a sort of argument for the existence of God.
In your writing, you also discuss the fact that some atheists deny the existence of God, not because they don't find arguments for God's existence, but because they do not want to accept the divine authority upon their lives. And you call this in your writings the cosmic authority problem. Proponents of this kind of atheism, which involves thinkers like Thomas Nagel,
Yes.
explicitly state that they do not want there to be a God. Now, how would you explain this? Are there different levels of atheism? Or would you say that all atheists do not want there to be a God, and Nagel is among those who courageously admits that?
I would not say that. I think it's very dangerous when we try to psychoanalyze our opposition. I think that rather we should leave their psychological motivations to them and God to work out. And what we do is simply respond to them at face value. If they give us an argument, we should respond to the argument by saying, this is why the argument fails. We should not say, well, that argument is just a smokescreen. Your real reason is some psychological motivation. I think we should not do that. Mm-hmm. In the case of people like Thomas Nagel, you see, he has said this explicitly. And so that's quite different. There we're not psychoanalyzing him. Mm-hmm. Nagel has said, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want to live in a universe like that. And so that is a self-confessed kind of emotional rejection of God.
Let us suppose that one agrees and comes to the point in accepting God's existence. Mm-hmm. Now, considering the old saying, all roads lead to Rome, can this not be an analogy for the different religions that exist out there? That these religions may represent different ways, but they all lead to the same God.
I think that anyone who has studied the world's religions understands that that is not true. The world's religions make different and contradictory claims about the nature of ultimate reality. To take an example, contrast Buddhism and Islam, for example. Islam believes in the existence of a personal creator and designer of the universe who is perfectly good, before whom we are sinful, whose forgiveness we need, and in the absence of turning to him in faith, we face everlasting damnation. The Buddhist believes none of that. The Buddhist believes that reality is ultimately impersonal, that we have no soul, that there is no difference between right and wrong, and therefore there is no problem of guilt, nothing to be forgiven, and when we die, we simply return to the whole and are personally annihilated. So Buddhism and Islam have almost nothing in common, and therefore it's simply impossible to say that they both teach the same thing. Now, if the arguments for the existence of God that I have offered are sound arguments, they narrow down the possible candidates for the true religion to just a handful. They will eliminate not only atheism, but also polytheism, all sorts of pantheistic religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. They basically narrow down the options to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and perhaps deism, a sort of religion of nature. And so that will be the choices from which you have to make your pick if these arguments for God's existence are sound.
Okay, let's talk from there. Why should one choose Christianity then? Why is the Christian God more convincing than the deities of other religion, and we are talking now for monotheistic religions?
Yes, that's right. I think you need to look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth to answer that question. Our viewers need to understand that Jesus of Nazareth is not just a religious figure in a stained glass window in a cathedral. Jesus of Nazareth is a real person of history whose life can be investigated by the ordinary canons of historical research, just like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. And the question will be, which of these religions of the world give the best account of Jesus of Nazareth? And here I think the Christian account of his life and teachings, and particularly of his resurrection from the dead, is superior to these other religions. Take, for example, Islam. Islam denies that Jesus was even crucified. It says in the Quran, they did not crucify him, neither did they kill him. It only appeared to be so. Well, this is a huge embarrassment for Islam, because the one single fact that is universally recognized by historical scholars about Jesus of Nazareth was that he died by Roman crucifixion. And yet this is the fact that Muhammad and the Quran chose to deny about Jesus, and therefore it cannot be an accurate, true understanding of who Jesus of Nazareth was, because it gets this central fact wrong.
Mm-hmm. Could it be Judaism?
That will depend then on if you think that Judaism gives an adequate account of this man, Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus had a radical self-understanding. He claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. He claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and holy men. He thought that he was the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. And he was eventually condemned by the Jewish high court in Jerusalem on the charge of blasphemy for making these claims, and then delivered over to the Romans for crucifixion on the charge of treason for making himself king of the Jews. Now, if that were the end of the story, then I think the Jewish person might be justified in saying this man was just another failed messianic pretender who got himself crucified by the Romans for his arrogant and blasphemous claims. But if, as the early Christians claimed, God has raised him from the dead, then that means that the God who was allegedly blasphemed by Jesus has publicly and unequivocally vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. And so the key question here will be, what happened to Jesus after his crucifixion. And very quickly, the majority of historians who've explored this question agree on 3 facts. Number 1, that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion on Friday. Secondly, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And thirdly, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the facts. The only question is, how do you best explain them? And I cannot think of any better explanation of these facts than the one that the disciples themselves gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And for that reason, I think the Bible-believing Jew should say, he was the Messiah after all, and I'm going to follow him and make him my Lord.
One of the objections that I've experienced in my ministry in Albania is that despite Jesus' redemptive work on the cross, it seems that not all people will be saved, and some of them will end up separated by his presence. So why can't an all-powerful God forgive all people?
God could extend forgiveness freely to all people, but that forgiveness has to be received in order for reconciliation to occur. And so long as people have free will, God cannot coerce them to accept his pardon of their sins. So in one sense, I don't think God sends anybody to hell. He stands with open arms, ready to forgive and reconcile. But people freely and irrevocably reject God and so separate themselves from him forever. So in one sense, God doesn't send them to hell, they send themselves. So I would say that God does freely forgive all persons. At least he offers that pardon to them, but it's up to us whether we will accept that grace and that reconciliation, or whether we will refuse it.
Is it any final message, Dr. Craig, that you would like to address our viewers in Albania?
Well, I think that Albania has suffered enormously for many, many decades under the tyranny of Soviet Marxism. And as it emerges into a new century and charts a different way, I hope that Albanians will consider the truth of the Christian faith in contrast to the atheism that Marxism tried to cram down their throats for so many decades. It is a new era now, a new day, and the growth of the Christian faith throughout the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, is burgeoning. It is growing all over the world. And I think it would be wonderful if Albanians were to consider afresh the claims of Jesus Christ and to turn to him for finding reconciliation and fellowship with God.
It has been my delight to discuss with you, Dr. Craig. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts in this
The
question.
pleasure has been all mine.
God bless.
Thank you.